Get us into Ludlam.
Thanks, Chair. I'm going to struggle to do this justice as well, unfortunately, in the time that we've got. Chair, can I just check, are we doing 4.1 and 4.2 in this bracket, or are you breaking them out separately?
Yes, 4.1 and 4.2.
Yeah, at the same time?
Yep.
Wow, okay. Look, let's start with homelessness. I've asked a number of times about the government's homelessness targets, and answers that come back on notice don't really identify whether there is a target. So I think I'll just ask this in black and white. Senator Fioravanti-Wells, these might end up coming to you if the officials aren't keen to take them on. Does this government have any targets to reduce homelessness? And if you do, what are those targets? Happy for anyone to take it on.
Senator, the key objective of the government is to reduce homelessness, and there are no specific targets. Our absolute objective is to reduce homelessness as much as possible. Well, the government's objective is.
So that's it, it's as much as possible.
The government is working very closely, as you know, with the states through the National Partnership Agreement on homelessness.
I'm sorry, and you don't get to set this. I'm not seriously not having a go at you. It's actually the politics that I'm more interested in. That the department doesn't set the target, but I just want to keep us to targets. There's no target. There's no benchmarks. There's not a certain number by a certain date, as there was under the previous government.
No, there isn't.
Thanks. That's all I'm trying to establish, and thank you. What are the current turnaway rates for specialist homelessness services?
Stuart Thomas, Branch Manager, Housing and Homelessness. According to the Specialist Homelessness Services Collection, which is conducted by the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare, from the period July 2014 to 30 June 2015, there were 329 instances per day where requests for services made were not assisted.
329 per day. That's right across the whole country, hey? Would you be able to, maybe in the interest of time, which is very short, could you possibly table us the document that you're quoting from, or else point to where we might find it?
It's in the Specialist Homelessness Services Survey that the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare conduct.
Okay.
And that's online, Senator.
Thank you. Is that up or down off of last year?
The previous year was 423 instances.
Per day?
Per day.
Okay.
Senator, sorry,
sure.
the other thing to note there too is that relates to the 2014-15 year. The new partnership agreement came into force on 1st of July, and you will recall that, you may recall in previous estimates we discussed that states and territories have, under the new 2-year agreement, also taken the opportunity to adjust the mix of their services, and we've also prioritised services to people at risk of homelessness, fleeing domestic and family violence, and youth homelessness. So part of what we'll need to see as the reporting for the new agreement comes through is to the impact that is having on the turnaway rate.
How long do you reckon it will take before we know what impact?
Senator, I would expect that we will start seeing some impacts through the next AHW Specialist Homeless Collection report, but we also won't be getting information in from the states until, I expect until late 2016, early 2017.
Okay, so maybe a full year before we will know. Okay. I believe it's still very much the case that the greatest single cause of homelessness is domestic violence, as women, often with children, fleeing homes that have become unsafe.
Yes, Senator, it's remained stable at around 25% of the clients presenting to homelessness providers. The principal cause of them seeking services is family and domestic violence.
Okay. So under Prime Minister Abbott, who didn't appear to have much interest in the portfolio, the homeless of $44 million was cut from new shelters. Is there any plan to reverse those cuts?
Senator, when you say 44 million $44 million was cut, I'm not sure what you mean.
This government's first budget was capital budget, basically. So services stayed static, but there's no new supply.
That's right. So the capital money was not included. As you know, there was no provision for any funding for for homelessness under the agreement. When this government came in, they reinstated the agreement for 2 years, and it includes money for services. It's, obviously homelessness rests with the states in terms of supply and services, and if they choose to put money to capital, that's their decision.
Senator, it's also worth noting that under the National Affordable Housing Agreement, there is also an allocation of around $260 million for homelessness, and that is available to be used for capital purposes.
But overall, is funding up or down since this current government took office?
So funding under the National Partnership Agreement on homelessness was $115 million, and that has been the amount for each year for the next 2 years of the agreement. The latest report on Australian Government Services, though, Senator, sets out how expenditure on homelessness services has been delivered. So in 14-15 there was $690 million spent by governments on homelessness, which was a 14% increase on the 2013-14 expenditure, which was $630 million.
Do you have any information on the current turnaway rate specifically at domestic violence services?
We'll take that on notice, Senator.
Yeah, if you could. Thank you, I'd appreciate that. In Rosie Batty's last speech as Australian of the Year, she pointed out that it can be actually quite risky to raise, I'm paraphrasing, but to raise awareness, and there is a strategy at the moment around awareness raising, and obviously that's been occurring over the last 12 months at least, is dangerous because it lifts demand on already stretched services and shelters. Is your experience consistent with that? You raise awareness about the issue, it's actually lifting demand, and the turnaway rate you just told us runs at 329 per day.
Not aware of anything specifically, unless Mr. Scott is, or Mr. Coburn. But as you said, I mean, obviously there is huge demand for services, but nothing specific in that space.
Has anybody in the department been tasked with working on ways to increase housing or accommodation for women and families escaping domestic violence?
Sorry, Senator, I missed the question.
Has anyone in the department been tasked with looking at ways to increase housing or accommodation, either emergency or longer term, for women and families escaping domestic violence?
So the first thing I'd say, Senator, is you're probably aware under the National Partnership Agreement on Homelessness, former Minister for Social Services, Morrison, in reaching agreement with the states to the 2-year extension, it was made clear that 50% had of that money, so 25 from the Commonwealth, 25 from the states, had to go to 3 priority areas, and one of those was women and children who were suffering from domestic violence.
Okay.
So that's the first thing. In terms of the other question, I don't know whether you have anything further.
No, other than there was a housing element to the family safety package that was announced last year.
How much was that?
It was around $17 million.
17.
Yeah.
So quite a bit less than half of what was cut from the capital budget of the providers. So helpful, but not super helpful. We're going backwards. I'd like to bring you, because time is unfortunately so short, the recommendations of the Senate inquiry into housing affordability. We canvassed homelessness, obviously, but it was affordability more broadly. Government senators supported 9 of 40 of the recommendations. I think Senator Seselja, who's chairing, actually was a member of that committee. So we've got unanimous agreement on 9 of the 40 recommendations, and I've got a list of the 9 here. One of them, I think you could say, has been taken up because we've got this new government working group focusing on innovative, transformative and implementable financing models. So that's consistent with one of the Senate inquiry's recommendations. I'm interested in the other 8. Of all of those remaining 8 recommendations that were unanimous, I can spell them out if you like, but time's a bit short. Is there any progress or any movements or any signs of life at all?
So, Senator, the government hasn't yet.
Sorry.
The government hasn't yet responded to that inquiry. Having said that, there is an enormous amount of work underway through the city's agenda for housing, through obviously the working group that we've been talking about, reform of federation, and a number of things. The government is considering its response in the context of all that work because it wants to make sure that everything is aligned and integrated, and so I can't really comment on anything more than that.
Well, when will we see some outputs? We're 2 years into what's effectively a scorched earth policy where a lot of good stuff that was going on was just wiped out. And now we're starting to maybe see some green shoots. But when will we see, for example, some outputs for this new working group? What are its outputs?
Mr. Scott talked to that earlier. We will see a report go to heads of Treasury at the end of this financial year, and a report go to COAG at the end of this calendar year. In the meantime, obviously, we're progressing a lot of initiatives behind the scene.
Behind the scenes?
Well, not behind the scene. We're doing a lot of work on the initiatives, I should say. That's a wrong phrase.
Okay. We're finding it more difficult to work in this space, I guess, because the government eliminated some of the really valuable peak bodies who were formerly the voice of the sector and would go back and aggregate feedback from community housing organisations, for example, crisis centres, for example. Is the government finding it more difficult to get a grip on what's going on with those peak bodies taken out of the picture?
So that's the first thing I'd say, Senator, is the government didn't eliminate those bodies.
Well, you cut their funding and then they cease to exist. Not you personally, Ms. Hand, but
so we have,
decision makers.
we continue to have very, very close and productive working relationships with all those organisations, and we engage them, including the intention to engage them through the working group process.
How are you doing that? Their money's gone. They're working for you in a voluntary capacity?
No, Senator. Like any organisations, I can't comment on how they get their other funding sources, but we're having very productive discussions with them.
Okay. If I just pass this one through on notice, if you like, rather than opening up a debate.
Yep.
Maybe through you, Senator Fioravanti-Wells,
Yes.
I'll be aware, behind the scenes, presumably preparations are furiously underway for the forthcoming budget. If the funding could be restored to those housing affordability and homelessness peak bodies, I think everybody in this room would find that of benefit.
I'll certainly pass that on, Senator
Would
Ludlam.
appreciate
I'm
it.
sure that the Minister's office is watching.
All right. Unfortunately, we
We'll
have
see.